Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. And today there was this post made by Bex from Grinding Games that shows off the new Slayer class, where the Gladiator only received minor tinkering around the edges and the Chieftain received a moderate rework. I think you could say that the Slayer has had a complete overhaul. So I'm going to go through the changes that have been made and discuss some of the sort of thoughts that I've had as to how you might build around the Slayer, both on a serious note and also on a silly note. So firstly, the Slayer's identity was a two-hand melee build that uses Life Leech as its primary defense. It was in a terrible spot because two-handed weapons have been very weak for some years in Path of Exile, and the Life Leech defense, for a period it was quite strong. There were some changes made that severely nerfed it. And so the one thing that it had going for it, its Life Leech power, was toned down in recent expansions. Now the Slayer has lost any link to two-handed weapons. It can use any attack skills. You can use most of the passives here can be used with wands, with bows, with one-handed weapons, dual-wielded, with a one-hander and a shield, or with two-handed weapons. And so you'll have a lot of flexibility with how you build it. It does still have some tools that will be strong potentially with two-handed weapons. It had a very unpopular stun node. This is gone and now replaced by a powerful crit node, which likely actually will help you stun. If you still want to play around with stuns, there's something very, very solid about that clunk that you hear when you hit a monster with a critical strike and stun it. It used to also have a melee splash effect. This has somewhat become baseline, and I'll show a video when we talk about the AoE nodes that demonstrate some of the changes that GGG have made to melee range. But so that node has been completely replaced with something completely different. So let's go through the various nodes that are available. So 1 and 2 is the critical strike side of the tree. And oh my god, this is strong. So attack damage and critical strike chance is just a small bonus. Overwhelm. Base critical strikes for attacks with weapons is 8%. So let's just say something about that first. 8% base crit means that you get much more benefit from increased critical strike item mods and from passive nodes. If your base critical strike is 5% on your weapon, and you wear items that have a combined 170% increased critical strike chances, you go from having 5% crit to 1 plus 1.7, so 2.7 times 5% is 13.5% critical strike chance. If your base crit is 8% and you wear those same items that have 170% increased critical strikes, then you go all the way up to 21.6% critical strike chance. So you see that you've increased your critical strike chance by 13.6% rather than just 8.5%. So that is a huge improvement. It makes all of your other critical strike nodes better. This is why the increased critical strike support gem is popular, because it increases base crit by around 2% at maximum level. So you may not actually need the increased critical strike support gem if you're using Overwhelm on a crit build. Time will tell on that. We'll have to mess around with building. But that mod alone would not just be a powerful Ascendancy node, but it would be a compelling reason to consider Slayer full stop, just for the Overwhelm node. It's that good. Next up, 10% to critical strike multiplier per nearby enemy up to 100%. This is very strong. Critical strike multiplier is a stat that adds a lot of damage when you're playing a crit build. It's often the hardest one of your main damage stats. It's the hardest one to get to a high level. Now, against bosses, this is not the strongest node around there. Against a typical boss, you might be fighting the boss, plus they may slowly spawn out adds. If we consider Uber Elder, you're mostly going to have 1 or 2 monsters nearby you, sometimes 3 if a Madness Propagator is up, and if both bosses are near it. During, of course, the intermission phases, when the portals are up, suddenly you will be getting plus 100% critical strike multiplier. But for a number of bosses, actually, the most tense parts are when the boss spawns a whole bunch of adds. and then for a short period of time, you are at absolute peak performance while you're swarmed. And then once you regain control of the situation, this powerful bonus goes back down to something, you know, that lets you settle back into standard DPS rather than explosive burst DPS for the trash. In any case, I think that this is going to be something that will perform pretty well overall. If you're someone that makes builds in Path of Building, however, I would strongly suggest that you assume you've only got 2 monsters nearby, so that you can get an accurate get a realistic damage assessment out of that, because I think on average you're only going to get 20% crit multi. But at times you certainly will get much more. And when you're fighting trash when mapping, oh god, that's going to be huge. That's basically going to be 100% crit multiplier against trash. Lastly, it'll be exceptionally good against Elder Portals. Elder Portals are durable and disgorge trash fast. You will generally have 100% crit multi against those. Next up, we have nearby enemies have minus 30% to critical strike multiplier. This is phenomenal. I don't think the Slayer is going to get into a position, at least on normal builds, where you can survive a slam from the Shaper. But if you do get that sort of hit point and endurance charge stacking, you may very well be able to completely rule out the chance of being one-shot by a crit if you've got enough health to survive the basic hit. In any zone that doesn't have the Deadly Crits mod on it, this will basically eliminate the danger posed by critical strikes from enemies that are nearby. Unfortunately, nearby can be a bit of a nebulous term. I'd like to get an exact definition of this. An exact definition may exist in the community, I just don't know what it is. Okay, so that's section 1 and 2, Overwhelm. This is going to be powerful on any build that wants to go crit. And I also would be remiss of me not to mention a meme build at this point. I think there is actually some potential to build a Starforge cast on critical strike Bladefall or Ethereal Knives or Blade Vortex build here. Starforge being, you know, a weapon that doesn't usually lend itself amazingly well to crit outside of unusual builds. But because there's also the ability to become immune to physical reflect on the tree, Starforge prevents you dealing elemental damage. I think there may actually be some potential for this here. And Cyclone is the default enabler skill for cast on critical strike, but when I get to showing off the video of the skill range gems, skill range effects in 3.7, it may even be possible to go for something as mad as Heavy Strike, which would be the ultimate silly meme build. And so that's something that I may mess around with in the new league. Okay, so sections 3 to 6 of the tree are sort of themed around boss killing, although they do offer a lot for general trash killing as well. So let's go through them. 3 is just attack damage and attack speed, and so is 5. This is nice, but these are the bread and butter nodes. They don't add anything special to your character. So let's start with Headsman. 10% more damage if you've killed recently, so that's in the last 4 seconds. This is nice. If you can just constantly be killing trash monsters, this will keep fueling it. 10% more damage means that it is a multiplier, and you can't take reflected physical damage. That's nice too. But then we've got the big thing, 20% more damage against unique enemies. It's one of those things that in Path of Exile that can be difficult to explain and get your head around at first, but it's important to do so. The difference between more and increased damage. More damage means it's a flat multiplier. So if you have 6 modifiers that add 20% more damage, then each one of them multiplies your damage by 1.2. Altogether, they'll multiply your damage by about 3. On the other hand, if you have 6 multipliers that all add 20% increased damage, each one will just add 20%. It'll end up being a combined times 2.2. So it's additive stacking versus multiplicative stacking. With Headsman, you're going to be consistently getting 20% more damage against map bosses and against special bosses like Shaper and Elder, and inconsistently getting 10% more damage on top of that for a total of 32% more damage. Remember, these stack multiplicatively. But that's inconsistent, so just assume you always have 20% more damage against a boss. Against trash, like when you're running through a map, you'll pretty much always have the 10% more damage. Headsman's a very strong node, and I think that everyone's going to feel pretty much compelled to take it. Next up we have Bane of Legends, which was one of the signature nodes of the Slayer historically and remains very good. In fact, it's been slightly improved. Kill enemies that have 20% or lower life when hit by your skills. So if you've got an enemy that's at 27% health, you smash it down to 19.5% with a hit, then this procs and automatically kills that monster. Monsters that are immune to Culling Strike have historically been immune to Bane of Legends, so that includes Uber Elder. You will not get this benefit against Uber Elder, but you will against most other bosses. Gain 20% increased attack speed for 20 seconds when you kill a rare or unique enemy. That's actually pretty sustainable during mapping. This is not something that you'll have up very much when fighting bosses, but it's something that you will have pretty sustainably while you're mapping. Gain 20% increased movement speed for 20 seconds when you kill an enemy. I think this is something that you can rely upon having, not just while you're fighting bosses. I think this is something that you will have active all the time on your character, pretty much, because most of the longer boss fights, you will have enemies that you're killing roughly every 20 seconds. There will be some sort of trash that is spawned. There'll be some occasions, like for instance, Kurgle, from memory, does not have trash except during a single specific phase when he's triggered to a certain hit point level. So Kurgle is an exception of endgame bosses that you will not get Bane of Legends movement speed on, but you will have this almost all the time. Side note, the Worm Flask, Writhing Jar, is something you may want to consider here as just a way of setting this off at the start of a map. I'll have to get confirmation that it actually does work, but I see no reason why it wouldn't, and it is a really strong flask. These boss killing side of things, let's just go through the numbers quickly. 20% more damage against unique enemies and 20% cull. These add up to a massive 50% effective more damage against boss monsters. Why is it 50% more? That's because you're killing monsters, you only need to do 80% of their health in order to kill them. So that's effectively a 25% more multiplier there. Because you're killing them when you've done 80% of their health. Let's say the monster has 10 million health. When you've done 8 million damage, you have then killed the monster. So this means that your 8 million damage counts as 10 million, which is 1.25 times as much damage. So the expanded Culling Strike is effectively a 25% more multiplier, which then stacks with the 20% more damage against unique enemies here, for a total of 50% more. Again, they stack multiplicatively, not additively, that's why it's not 45%, it's 50% more. So let's just repeat that. That is 50% more damage against bosses. This is a staggering amount of damage. One of the most powerful nodes in the Berserker Ascendancy has been 40% more damage. This is better and does not come with the drawbacks that the Berserker Ascendancy has on that node. Now, obviously, the Berserker's a pretty weak Ascendancy at the moment, but we'll see what comes out of that. Even against Uber Elder, where it's not quite as amazing, it's still 20% more damage, which is amazing anyway. Now, if you want to farm Azaro with very low gear quality, so, you know, say 8 hours into the league, if you're the sort of person that gets to maps in 5.5, then this is what you want. I'm not that sure that Labyrinth farming early will be a great idea. That'll be a whole separate video. But if you want to do it and disagree with my advice that it's not a good idea, then it is a stellar setup for that. And just the 20% increased movement speed. Like, if you think how insane people went about Onslaught on boots in Synthesis League, or if you think about how much people sought out the upgrade from 30% increased move speed to 35% increased move speed when that was added in, I believe, it was added back in the time that the shape was added. So that was the Atlas of Worlds expansion. All of these changes were things that players really liked, and this is 4 times as much as going from 30 move speed to 35 move speed. So yeah, that's really strong. Anyways, let's have a look quickly at the life leech section of the tree. So this is 7, 8, 9, and 10. So you get Endless Hunger, which provides infinite leech while fighting trash because overkill damage is leeched as life. You can't be stunned or bled while leeching. This is quite strong. Status immunities, so stun immunity and bleed immunity, are really nice to have. Essentially, this frees up a flask, except in situations where you fear that you might take bleed damage whilst you've got no enemies around. The only real spot that this comes up in practical gameplay that I can think of is in the Labyrinth, where you may still want a bleed immunity flask for the traps that are encountered. There are the pressure plate spike traps that you stand on them, and then a couple of seconds later they spring up. They inflict 60% of your life plus 36% of your energy shield as immediate physical damage, and then they inflict a powerful bleed on you. That bleed can kill you if you cop that, and then you immediately just start running. So those traps are a reason that you may still want to at least own an immunity to bleeding flask, but you'd only equip it while doing the Labyrinth. This is really, really solid, and synergizes well with Brutal Fervor, which gives you basically, I'm not going to call it God mode while leeching, but it's a lot of both increased damage capacity and defense. 6% reduced damage taken while leeching is amazing. If you've got 6,000 health, then that's basically like having 400 more life in terms of the amount of defense that it gives you. 50% increased damage from attacks and 15% attack speed while leeching are really nice. But the key there is life leech effects not being removed at full life. That is a thing that historically was the primary reason to take the Slayer Ascendancy. Some of the life leech formulas were changed behind the hood recently, and that meant that you were no longer able to sustain this indefinitely. However, whilst you are actively in combat and not during the first 1 or 2 seconds of a combat, Brutal Fervor basically means you have 20% life regen and 15% increased attack speed and 50% damage and 6% reduced damage taken while leeching. This is incredibly powerful again, and something that is a really compelling choice. You'll notice there's a very difficult choice to pick for, and that's a major theme of the Slayer Ascendancy. They have really made it so that, unlike the Gladiator, where either you're a block specialist and then you've got 3 nodes you have to take, and the 4th one there's no amazing choices, or you're not a block specialist and you take everything that's not a block node. With the Slayer Ascendancy, all of these nodes are compelling for pretty much every build, and you're going to have some difficult choices. That said, I think that it will be a popular choice to take the life leech nodes and the boss killing nodes and ignore the rest, but it may also be a popular choice to take the life leech nodes and to take impact and then to sort of go only partway up the boss killing tree. Lots of options to consider. Anyways, that's the life leech section. Next up, we have the 2 other isolated nodes. We have the 11 and 12, which is the accuracy and range side of things. Impact grants 50% global accuracy rating. This is a lot. This is a lot of accuracy, especially if you're using a sword or something like that that already has flat accuracy on it, or you've got some flat accuracy on your tree. On your other gear, and then some percentage accuracy maybe on the tree. That seems to be a small bonus at first, but it's actually going to be pretty powerful. I'd have to dig deep into the accuracy formula to put numbers on this, but I think for people that are running a critical strike build that misses a lot, this may wind up being a 10 to 15% more multiplier on damage. But don't take my word for that. That's something you should check in Path of Building when the new updates to that program come out. +2 to melee weapon and unarmed attack range. I mentioned earlier that there was a video I wanted to show on this. This is Grinding Gear Games' video on weapon range. So I'm just going to demonstrate this. This is what low weapon range looks like in 3.7. This may look pretty familiar. This is high weapon range. Notice how weapon range is affecting a skill that it has never affected in the past. Or at least not in any particularly noticeable way. This attack is now hitting everything in the range. You see there that those 2 monsters were killed by the first strike there. So that is the impact section there. This replaces the old melee splash side of things that was in the Slayer historically. So, +2 to melee weapon and unarmed attack range is of considerable benefit when you are using a skill that used to be single target and has now been changed to be a small frontal cone. 5% increased area of effect per enemy killed recently, up to 50%, is a nice bonus while mapping, and I think will feel a lot like Reeve. If you've ever played a Reeve build, this should feel like the bonuses that you get from Reeve. It should apply those to other skills as well. So Reeve, if you've never used it, your first hit has quite a small range, but then that gives you a stack of a buff that then increases all of your future Reeve attacks. You can get up to 4 naturally and up to 8 by using Val Reeve, and this then allows you to get quite a considerable range on what is otherwise a very close range melee attack. Impact, I think, will give that escalation of range to other characters. You also deal up to 15% more melee damage to enemies based on proximity. Now, we don't have any numbers on this, so it's hard to judge exactly how good it is. It's probably good without being outstanding. I think the idea here is that you go toe-to-toe with bosses, and so when you're fighting a boss, you just go right up close and go smack, 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 and get 15% more damage. When you're fighting trash monsters, you take advantage of the increased range to hit enemies across a larger area. Lastly up, we have Masterful Form, which is an interesting endurance charge shenanigans node. The key benefit that it gives you is that your maximum endurance charges is equal to your maximum frenzy charges. So what this means is that if without this node you would have 3 maximum endurance charges and 7 maximum frenzy charges, because you've got a bunch of extra frenzy charges on gear, you've gone out of your way on the passive tree to pick them up, now suddenly your maximum endurance charges is raised up to 7. On the flip side, if your tree was reversed around a bit, you would go from having, say you had 7 endurance charges and 3 frenzy charges, this node would screw you up because you'd suddenly only have 3 of each. So basically, whatever your frenzy charges is, your endurance charge cap is set to that. It doesn't give you any ability to generate charges. You're going to have to figure out how to do that yourself. There's a bunch of ways you can do this, everything from endurance charge on melee stun, support, which hasn't been popular in the past, but I'm feeling hopeful that it might be more popular this league, through to such tricky things as the various Cheola Dream Jewels. On the flip side, it's pretty easy for a Slayer to sustain maximum frenzy charges by virtue of using Blood Rage, a gem that pretty much every Slayer will expect to use. I think Masterful Form is an interesting effect, but one that won't get picked much because there's just so much power in the Slayer tree that I can't really see anyone finding a home for it. However, I'm open to being proven wrong. In terms of build ideas, how would I go about building a Slayer? The first option is to stick with the traditional two-handed weapon. Two-handed weapons do look like they're going to be a bit better in 3.7. We have heard that their base physical damage is going up to 160% of the base physical damage of a one-handed weapon. At the moment it's 140%. So that's a massive, massive increase in damage. I'm not sure that it will be enough. Time will tell. I think it will need more than just that. I've already mentioned the meme build of Starforge cast on crit using the Overwhelm node. I think that if you wanted to go that route, and I'm not really suggesting this as a serious build, but it's something that might work, I would suggest that you take Overwhelm, obviously. I think you would need to take Impact because you're going to need the extra range, and then you're going to have to make a very difficult decision. Do you take Bane of Legends, or do you take Brutal Fervor? You can only take one of the two. and I'll leave that decision with you. Players can sort of mess around with it. I do think that Brutal Fervor will probably turn out to be the better choice, but Bane of Legends has that go fast, go fast, go fast side of things that will also be compelling. Really, it comes down to, for defense, pick Bane of Legends. For offense, pick Bane of Legends. For defense, pick Brutal Fervor. I don't suggest going partial commitment on each of these lines, because each one of them is, it's better when you've got the whole line. Second is just a straightforward melee build that is optimized for killing bosses. If you want to go this route, I think the choice is pretty obvious. You're going to be taking both Bane of Legends and Brutal Fervor, which is all of your Ascendancy points. And this is going to be an outstanding setup for running Eternal Labyrinth early in a league, and it will also be something that can be used with any of a two-handed weapon, or a one-hander plus shield, or two one-handed weapons. Any of these should be viable for killing Uber very quickly in a league as well. You won't be as tanky as some of the occultist builds in the current league in Synthesis that can just laugh off the Shaper's Slam and the Uber Elder's Annulus attack and Uber Elder's Slam and all of the massive attacks that you can get hit with in that fight. You will need to mechanically dodge the super hard hitting skills that those bosses use. Or possibly you could use some of the new defensive skills, the active defense skills. They might be able to keep you alive through those big hits if you want to try that as well. That said, I always recommend learning to mechanically dodge them. Lastly, I think there is a Reeve build around Impact, around Bane of Legends for speed, and then potentially around Overwhelm for zipping around the map quickly, getting critical strikes on enemies, and dealing lots of damage. Or alternately, you could go conceivably Impact, Masterful Form, and Bane of Legends to then pick up lots of Frenzy charges on the tree, get Endurance charges for free that way, use them as your primary defensive layer. Impact for the ability to hit enemies over a large radius, and then use Bane of Legends so that you do have some ability to kill bosses. Reeve is a skill that is typically used, typically it's been used with Physical Claws have been the most popular skill, but there's no reason that it has to be Physical Claws. You could use it with anything from Physical Daggers, Physical Claws, through to potentially even something as unusual as Hand of Wisdom in action. A lot of these are just going to need to be experimented with once we get the actual skills themselves. Finally, there'll be a whole lot of new melee skills in the new expansion, so maybe there'll be something new to try as well. These haven't been revealed yet, so we're just going to have to wait and see. Anyways, if you've got any questions, fire away. Otherwise, have a good one.